Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Wednesday Word from First United Methodist Church. This past Sunday morning, we read from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, in which Jesus tells the parable of the blank Samaritan. Now, regardless of our familiarity with Scripture, we probably know that the missing word is good. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? But here's an interesting piece of trivia. Jesus himself never uses the word good to describe the Samaritan, nor does Luke the gospel writer. So where did we get the word good? Well, across the centuries, as people labeled the particular sections of Scripture, someone chose to call this the story of the Good Samaritan. Why? Probably because most of Scripture is written through the perspective of the people of Israel, and most Israelites do not consider most Samaritans good. We see an illustration of this only one chapter earlier. In chapter 9 of Luke's Gospel, when Jesus and his entourage try to pass through a Samaritan village, they're not allowed to because the Samaritans realize that they're on their way to Jerusalem. We also see an encounter that Jesus has with a Samaritan woman in John's Gospel, chapter 4. In verse 20, she says to Jesus, "Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that people must worship in Jerusalem." By this mountain, she's talking about Mount Gerizim. And along with its counterpart, Mount Ebal, it stands guard over the city of Sychar, as it's known in John's Gospel, chapter 4, when she has her encounter with Jesus. But in the Old Testament, that city is known as Shechem. Now, there on Mount Gerizim, about 300 years before she has this encounter with Jesus, her ancestors, the Samaritans, have built a temple to worship God, and that temple rivals the temple in Jerusalem, where she says that Jesus says most people must worship. But when she says our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, she may not merely be referring to the ancestors of the Samaritans. She might be saying to Jesus, your ancestors and my ancestors, our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, pointing back to the common heritage of the Samaritans and the Israelites. Way back in Genesis chapter 12, when Abram first enters into the land that God promises to his descendants, beginning with the second part of verse 5, we read that when they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem. And we learn that there at Shechem, in the shadow of Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, Abram builds an altar to the Lord, and that becomes the very first altar to God made and built in the promised land. In Joshua chapter 8, as Joshua leads the people of Israel into this land that was promised to their ancestor Abram, when they have occupied the land and begun to triumph over the Canaanites, there at Mount Ebal, the other of the two mountains over the city of Shechem, Joshua builds an altar, and that becomes the first altar that the people of Israel build to God after they re-enter the city. So you can see how this woman would say, our ancestors worshipped here. Later in the book of Joshua, he calls all the people back together for that famous covenant renewal service in which he says, choose this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And clearly the woman there in Sychar, or Shechem as it's known in the Old Testament, is labeling for Jesus the claim that Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal and the city of Shechem have to be even more ancient than Jerusalem in worshiping God. But the history of Shechem, and therefore Samaria, sours a little bit in 1 Kings chapter 12. When King Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam ought to be the king of Israel, but Jeroboam rises up in rebellion along with the northern kingdom, and guess where the rebellion starts? There in the city of Shechem, which becomes the central city of Samaria. And there's a northern kingdom and there's a southern kingdom, and the southerners see the northerners as the rebels. And a few years later, King Omri makes Shechem the capital city of the northern kingdom, and his son Ahab marries Jezebel, who brings the worship of Baal to the people of Israel. So not only are they rebels, but now they're rebels and they're people who have become heathen, they're people who have become heretics. So the southerners look upon them as rebels and people who have rebelled against God. And we all know that Elijah has that big contest with the priests of Baal, and it becomes a time when Ahab and Jezebel become dirty words almost. And then later, when the northern kingdom is conquered by the Assyrians take away some of the leaders of Israel and repopulate the area with people they've conquered in other lands, and the Southerners at least have the perspective that the Northerners have intermarried and therefore again have polluted and diluted their bloodlines as people of Israel. And then when the people of the southern kingdom are carried away into exile in Babylon and come back and try to rebuild their city of Jerusalem, we read that the Samaritans, according to Ezra and Nehemiah, oppose the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. And so the enmity between the Southerners and the Northerners becomes even more intense. And not only do they differ over where they should worship, but the Samaritans sort of look down upon the Southerners, the Judeans, the Israelites, because they believe they don't keep strictly enough some of the laws about Sabbath and dietary restrictions that we read in the Old Testament law. So that by the time of Jesus, the divorce is complete. They see themselves as opponents. They see themselves as unfaithful to God. They see the others as their enemies. It might be the case that by Jesus' time, an Israelite would say about a Samaritan, the only good Samaritan is a dead one. Maybe people in our culture have said that at times. Maybe during the 1940s, people like you and me would have said, the only good German soldier is a dead one. The only good Japanese is a dead one. Maybe we've been stirred to that kind of hatred, and we've been stirred to that kind of enmity in our own lives. Maybe to a lesser degree, we've been able to see ourselves as so opposite to another kind of person because of convictions and beliefs that we would be surprised to learn that one of them might be labeled good. Is there such a thing, we might ask, as a good Republican or a good Democrat? Is there such a thing, we might ask, as a good person of Arabic descent? Is there such a thing, we might ask, as a good Muslim? Well, in this story of the Samaritan, the lawyer who poses the question to Jesus, probably the priest and the Levite who are in the story, would probably least expect to find a good person coming from Samaria. And maybe the point of Jesus' story is that those three, the priest, the Levite, and the lawyer, ought to widen their sense, widen the circle of whom they might consider a neighbor, because God already has. Maybe that's the challenge to you and me today. Whomever you find opposite, whomever you find opponent, realize that among them are good ones. Realize that they might look at you and be surprised if you were good and had any redeeming virtues. And widen the circle of people that you and I consider neighbors, because God already has.